In the heat of the deep South, nestled among the sprawling, ancient oak trees draped in Spanish moss, Alabama stands as a reminder of both beauty and brutality, of forgotten histories and voices long silenced. The state's antebellum past, particularly in its rural pockets, still clings to the land, from its large cotton plantations to the quiet, dusty towns where old wounds fester beneath the surface. These towns, though seemingly sleepy in modern times, have a dark history, one that traces its roots back to the forced labor of enslaved people who lived, worked, and often died in the shadows, without leaving much of a trace. In one such town, once a thriving hub of the cotton economy, this forgotten history has left behind a mystery that continues to echo through the generations. The town itself is small, its streets lined with crumbling buildings that once housed proud families who amassed fortunes from the sweat and blood of the enslaved. Now, these same buildings are cracked and weathered, a physical representation of the collective memory of the town, which, like the town itself, has long been forgotten or deliberately buried. This town, like so many others in Alabama during the antebellum period, existed in a time of extreme social and economic divisions. At the heart of these divisions was the institution of slavery, which defined the very fabric of society. The enslaved people in this town, predominantly black men, women, and children, were considered property rather than people. They labored under the brutal and watchful eyes of their masters, working the fields, maintaining the homes, and often bearing children who, too, would grow up in bondage. But it wasn't just the physical labor that defined the lives of these enslaved people, it was the constant erasure of their identities. The names of the women, men, and children who lived and died on these plantations were seldom recorded in the official histories. When they were, their names were often misspelled or misrecorded, reduced to mere numbers in a ledger, if they were recorded at all. The records that did exist were not meant to honor these individuals, rather, they were simply tools used to maintain an economic system built on human suffering. In these records, there was no room for the nuances of their lives, only their value as workers and the transactional nature of their existence. The enslaved girls of Alabama were some of the most invisible figures in this world. They had no rights, no power, and no voice. Often, their identities were erased entirely, their births and deaths unremarked upon, as though they had never existed in the first place. Their lives were reduced to roles, field hands, house servants, and, in many cases, sexual commodities for their masters. The trauma they endured was compounded by the fact that, in death, they were erased as thoroughly as they were in life. No monuments were erected to them. No commemorations were made in their honor. Their stories, if told at all, were buried beneath the weight of centuries of systemic injustice. Yet, as with so many forgotten people, some of these girls' stories have endured in whispers, passed down through generations. Perhaps it was the way they looked, the stark contrast of their features compared to the rest of the town, that captured the attention of those who dared to remember. Or perhaps it was the way they moved through the world, with a quiet resilience that spoke of something deeper than the cruelty they endured. For some, these girls were more than just victims of history, they were symbols of a legacy that refused to be forgotten. This particular town was home to one such girl, whose presence, both physical and symbolic, would eventually become the center of a mystery that no one could explain. The girl's identity, her origins, and even her appearance would come to haunt the town long after she was gone. In a way, she embodied the complexities of the history of Alabama itself, a state defined by its contradictions, where beauty and brutality existed side by side, where the dark past could never fully be buried, no matter how much society tried. Alabama, like much of the South, was a place where racial divides ran deep. The white families who owned the land, the vast plantations, and the enslaved people lived in a world separated by an invisible but unmistakable barrier. The enslaved were expected to know their place, perform their labor, obey their masters, and remain silent. The lives of the enslaved girls were no different. They were expected to be obedient, to serve without question, and to never question the world in which they found themselves. Yet, despite this overwhelming oppression, some managed to survive, to endure, and in some cases, to resist in the most subtle of ways. The town itself was like so many others in the South. Its economy was built on cotton, its streets lined with the homes of wealthy families who never had to work a day in their lives. The enslaved people, including the girls, worked the fields, picking cotton from dawn until dusk, enduring both the physical and emotional toll of their labor. For the girls, the work was grueling and often humiliating. They were denied any semblance of childhood, forced to grow up too quickly in a world that demanded their labor without offering them any chance at freedom or self-determination. In the heat of summer, the air in Alabama hung thick with humidity, and the sound of rustling cotton leaves was a constant backdrop to the lives of the enslaved. For the girls, it was a constant reminder of their place in the world. Their hands were roughened by the harsh work, their bodies weary from the unrelenting labor. They had little to look forward to in life, save for the hope, however faint, that one day they might be free. But freedom seemed a distant dream, one that many of them would never live to see. It was against this backdrop of hardship and silence that the girl who would become the focus of this mystery grew up. She worked on a plantation, like so many others, but there was something different about her, something that set her apart from the other enslaved girls. The details of her life, like so many of the enslaved, are shrouded in mystery, but it's clear that she left an indelible mark on the town. Her story, though incomplete, continues to haunt the people who lived in that town, and to this day, her memory lingers in the whispers of the descendants of those who once called Alabama home. In the end, this girl's story would be remembered not for the life she lived, but for the unanswered questions that remain. Who was she? Where did she come from? And why does her legacy endure in a place that has long tried to forget? These questions would echo through the generations, unanswerable and yet, in some ways, more powerful than any definitive answer could have been. The town may have moved on, but its silence, its refusal to acknowledge the truth, ensured that this mystery would never fully fade away. The forgotten town of Alabama would never be the same, for the ghosts of the past are never truly gone. In the heart of the South, the lives of enslaved girls are often relegated to shadows, their stories lost to the fog of time. Yet beneath the oppressive silence of history, their lives were fraught with unimaginable hardship, and they played a role in the systems of power and control that shaped this nation's past. The world they inhabited was one of relentless labor, brutal dehumanization, and, in many ways, complete erasure from the official historical record. For the young girls born into slavery, survival was a quiet act of rebellion, a daily testament to resilience in a society that denied them not only their freedom but their humanity. The enslaved girls of Alabama, like those across the South, were often the most vulnerable among the enslaved population. Though their lives were marked by the same brutal conditions faced by the men and boys who worked the land, their experiences were uniquely shaped by gender. They faced sexual violence, forced labor, and emotional abuse in ways that were invisible to the white families who owned them, their needs and suffering often ignored or dismissed entirely. They were expected to work from a young age, with no chance to play, to learn, or to grow. Their lives were molded by the calluses of hard labor, the weight of servitude, and the shadow of constant fear. For many of these girls, childhood was a fleeting moment, if it existed at all. The reality of their existence began long before they could even understand it. They were born into a world where their futures were already determined, where they were seen as property and their lives valued solely for the work they could provide. From the moment they were old enough to hold a needle or carry a basket, they were pressed into labor. Some worked as house servants, cleaning, cooking, and tending to the needs of the master's family. Others worked in the fields, picking cotton, tobacco, or rice, tasks that were physically grueling and unrelenting. In either case, their lives were defined by the endless cycle of labor that was expected of them, with no room for the development of self or identity. Perhaps most harrowing of all, the enslaved girls often had no protection from the sexual violence of the men who owned them. Enslaved women and girls were frequently subjected to sexual exploitation by their masters, who viewed them as nothing more than tools for pleasure and reproduction. The children of these rapes were often considered property as well, further solidifying the sense of ownership that these men had over the bodies of the enslaved. This abuse, while pervasive, was rarely discussed or acknowledged by the larger society, but it left deep scars on the lives of the young girls who endured it. These experiences were not only a violation of their bodies but also a profound betrayal of their humanity. As for the girls who did not fall victim to sexual violence, their lives were still shaped by the oppressive structure of slavery. Their labor in the fields was never-ending, and it came at a great personal cost. It was not uncommon for enslaved girls to work from dawn until dusk, often with only brief breaks to eat. Their bodies, too young to bear such burdens, were nevertheless expected to perform tasks that could leave them crippled by exhaustion or illness. And yet, despite the immense toll it took on their physical well-being, the work never stopped. In the eyes of their masters, their pain was irrelevant, their bodies only valuable for the work they could produce. Despite the harshness of their lives, enslaved girls developed a sense of community with one another. Though their voices were suppressed, they found ways to support one another in small, subtle acts of resistance. Whether through shared stories, whispered words of comfort, or simply the solidarity of surviving another day, these girls formed bonds that helped them endure their bleak existence. These relationships, though fleeting and fragile, provided a sense of hope in a world designed to strip away all sense of self and dignity. In the larger social order, these enslaved girls were invisible. They were not seen as individuals, but as part of the collective labor force that sustained the plantation economy. Their names, their stories, their very humanity were denied to the larger society. They were not part of the records, not part of the families that made up the history of Alabama. In town meetings, in church services, and in family gatherings, their absence was assumed. Their lives were a silent void, their existence nothing more than a footnote in the annals of history. If they were remembered at all, it was in the context of their labor, never as human beings with hopes, dreams, and identities. But in this silence, there were exceptions. Sometimes, the most unusual of circumstances led to moments where the lives of these girls were remembered, if only briefly. Occasionally, a girl's striking appearance might prompt a comment from someone who noticed her difference. A peculiar feature, a distinct mannerism, or an unusual way of moving through the world might draw attention. For a brief moment, she would become more than just a nameless figure on a ledger, she would become a person, a subject of conversation, a curiosity. But these moments were fleeting. In the end, she would slip back into the shadows, her existence erased once more. The story of this particular girl, the one at the heart of the mystery that still lingers over the town, was one of these rare exceptions. Her life, though fraught with the same suffering that defined the lives of all enslaved girls, took on a particular resonance because of the way she was seen, differently than the others. In a world where every aspect of her being was meant to go unnoticed, she became a subject of fascination, a mystery that no one could explain. The girl's physical appearance was strikingly different from that of other enslaved girls in the town. Some said she had features that were more European than African, fairer skin, lighter eyes, and a certain grace that seemed at odds with her status. To those who observed her closely, she seemed to belong to a different world, one that was out of place in the brutal reality of Alabama's plantations. It was this physical difference that would become the focal point of the mystery. The girl's very presence seemed to challenge the rigid boundaries that defined the world of the enslaved. To some, she was a curiosity, to others, she was a symbol of something deeper, an embodiment of the contradictions that ran through the South's complex racial and social fabric. For the masters who owned her, she was merely another piece of property, her value only measured by the work she could perform and the children she might bear. For the other enslaved girls who worked alongside her, she was a symbol of the painful divisions that defined their world, a reminder that their lives, though equally valuable in their own right, were shaped by forces beyond their control. But the real mystery lay in the girl's origins. Where had she come from? Who were her parents? And why did she appear so different from the others? These questions lingered, unanswered and unanswerable, for years. The girl's life, like the lives of so many others, would be marked by this silence, a silence that both protected and condemned her. The legacy of the enslaved girls of Alabama, of all those who lived and died in the shadows, would continue to haunt the town long after they were gone. Their stories, though lost to history, would leave behind a lingering presence, a reminder that the past cannot be fully erased, no matter how hard society tries. The mystery of the girl's identity would become more than just a question of who she was. It would become a question of what she represented. For in her story, as in the stories of so many enslaved girls, lay the haunting reminder of a history that was never fully acknowledged, a past that was never fully confronted. And in the silence surrounding her life, we are left to wonder just how much more has been forgotten, and how much is still waiting to be uncovered. The whispers began almost as soon as the girl arrived in the town. At first, it was just a passing remark from one of the enslaved workers, a comment made in the dead of night, when the air was thick with the heat and the exhaustion of another long day. The girl had been seen by some of the townspeople, working alongside the others, yet there was something about her that didn't quite fit. She was different, they said. Not in any dramatic way, but in a way that was noticeable if you knew where to look. She moved with an elegance that seemed almost out of place in a world built on unrelenting labor. Her features, her fairer skin, her eyes that caught the light in a strange way, seemed to set her apart from the others. To the untrained eye, she might have simply been another young girl born into slavery. But to those who paid attention, to those who noticed the details that others missed, she was something more. And that something more was both unsettling and intriguing. At first, these murmurs were small, inconsequential. A passing observation from someone working nearby. A comment made in the privacy of a home, where families sat after dinner, gossiping about their lives. But slowly, as time passed and the girl continued to live and work in the town, the whispers grew. People started to notice more about her, and it was as if every small detail, her appearance, her movements, the way she carried herself, began to form a picture. It was a picture that no one could quite define, yet everyone seemed to agree on one thing: there was something about her that didn't belong. It wasn't long before people began to speculate. Where had she come from? Who was she really? Some said she had come from a distant plantation in another county, a place where slaves were known to be of a different stock. Others whispered that she wasn't from Alabama at all, but from somewhere far more exotic. Some even began to suggest that perhaps she wasn't African at all. The townspeople, eager to make sense of her presence, sought to explain her in terms they could understand. They needed a narrative that would fit her into the world they knew, even if that narrative was nothing more than a half-formed rumor. The girl, for her part, remained silent. She went about her work, just as the others did, never responding to the questions or the curious looks cast in her direction. There was a quiet dignity to her, a calmness that seemed to match her mysterious appearance. It was as if she knew something the others didn't, something that made her resistant to their prying eyes. She held her own, never drawing attention to herself, yet always remaining just a little bit separate from the others. And in that separation, in that subtle distance, the mystery surrounding her grew. The whispers began to take on a life of their own. People started to ask questions, but the answers were always the same: no one knew for sure where she had come from. There were theories, of course, but none of them ever seemed to fit perfectly. Some said she was the daughter of a nearby plantation owner, a child born of a brief and forgotten union. Others suggested that she might be the product of a distant African tribe, with no connections to the local community. Some even claimed that she was the daughter of a wealthy family from the north, who had been sent to Alabama under mysterious circumstances, though no one could explain why. But as the theories grew, so too did the uncertainty. No one could agree on her origins, and the more they speculated, the more elusive she seemed to become. As the months passed, the girl's presence in the town became a source of quiet tension. The more the townspeople tried to pin her down, to label her and place her into a category that made sense to them, the more she resisted. She continued to work alongside the other enslaved, moving from task to task with a quiet efficiency that drew little attention, at least, not outwardly. But inwardly, her very presence created a ripple in the fabric of the town. People couldn't stop talking about her, couldn't stop wondering about her. She was a constant, looming question mark in a world that thrived on certainty. And it wasn't just the white townspeople who were curious about her. The other enslaved people, too, took notice. They, too, had their suspicions, their quiet questions. Some wondered if she was one of their own, if her ancestry could be traced back to Africa, just like theirs. Others speculated that she might be a child of a different sort, a child born of a union that had never been publicly acknowledged, the kind of union that was never spoken about. But among the enslaved, the mystery ran deeper. There was a sense of unease that surrounded the girl, a sense that she was not quite like the others, even though she shared the same burdens and toiled in the same fields. The other girls who worked alongside her were perhaps the most affected by the whispers. They had lived their lives in the shadows, their identities buried beneath the weight of slavery, and they had learned to survive in a world that did not acknowledge their existence. But this girl, this mysterious figure who seemed to live in the same world but somehow apart from it, reminded them of something they had long buried in their hearts, the hope of something different, something more. Her very presence seemed to promise that there was a world beyond the one they knew, a world where they might be seen, where they might matter. And that hope, however faint, was something they had not allowed themselves to entertain for a long time. But with that hope came fear. Fear of what her difference might mean. Fear that she was something to be feared, something to be hidden away or erased. The other enslaved girls began to wonder if she might be the key to their own freedom, or if she might bring them into even greater danger. They had been taught to keep their heads down, to remain invisible, to be silent. But this girl, this strange girl with her fair skin and her mysterious origins, was a reminder that there was always something more lurking beneath the surface of their lives. And for some, that reminder was both exhilarating and terrifying. As the months wore on, the girl's presence continued to stir unrest in the town. Some townspeople began to suggest that there was something supernatural about her, that perhaps she was a spirit or a ghost who had been sent to reveal the hidden sins of the town. Others dismissed these ideas, attributing the rumors to nothing more than superstition. But no one could deny that the girl was different, that she did not fit the mold of what was expected. In a town built on rigid social structures, where every person was supposed to know their place, she was an anomaly. And that, in itself, was a mystery that could not be explained away. By now, the mystery surrounding the girl had become an undeniable force in the town. It was no longer just a question of who she was, but why she seemed to unsettle everyone who came into contact with her. The whispers had turned into something much more significant, a force that could not be ignored, a presence that had begun to shape the very fabric of the town's existence. The girl was no longer just an enigma, she had become a symbol of everything the town had tried to suppress, a reminder that the past could never truly be buried. And as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months, one thing became clear: the girl, in her silence and her difference, had become something much larger than herself. She was no longer just an individual in a world of forgotten lives, she was a symbol of the town's past, a living, breathing testament to the history that could not be erased, no matter how hard they tried. As the years passed, the mystery surrounding the girl only deepened, becoming woven into the fabric of the town's consciousness. Despite the town's attempts to move on and bury the past, her presence remained a quiet reminder of a history they would rather forget. Her story, still mostly unknown to the people who lived around her, reflected a larger narrative, one about the systematic erasure of the enslaved and the histories that shaped the South. This was a time when the people in power, the landowners, and those who controlled the economic structures, sought to maintain the comfortable fiction of a past that ignored the real cost of their prosperity. But in the silence surrounding the girl, something more sinister was taking place, a collective effort to keep the ugly truths of history buried. The town itself, as quiet as it seemed in its routine, was deeply tied to the legacy of slavery. Its wealth had been built on the backs of enslaved people, people whose names were rarely recorded in any significant detail, whose lives were reduced to tools for labor. Their suffering, their sacrifices, and their very existence were barely acknowledged, let alone honored. History had been written by the victors, by the landowners and the families who held power, and it was an incomplete history, a history that erased the voices of the enslaved. It was in this context that the girl's story became one that was not easily spoken. Her difference, her striking appearance, her oddness in the town's narrative, unsettled the delicate structure of silence that had been carefully cultivated. The people who noticed her were the ones who saw beneath the surface, the ones who had the courage or the curiosity to ask questions. But for most, it was easier not to ask. Easier to ignore her, to chalk her up to some strange anomaly that didn't quite fit into the framework they had constructed for themselves. After all, the more they spoke of her, the more they risked unearthing truths that had long been buried. The girl herself, for all her striking differences, did not make waves. She simply went about her work, living a quiet life in the shadow of the world that surrounded her. She never spoke much to anyone, and though she had a presence that drew attention, she seemed to exist on the periphery of everyone else's lives. It was as if she had become part of the landscape, a fixture in the town's routine, a silent observer who never quite belonged. It was, in some ways, a role that allowed her to remain unnoticed in the ways that truly mattered. While others speculated about her origins, she seemed untouched by the questions. She worked alongside the other enslaved girls, bearing the same burdens, but with an air of distant calm, as if she knew something that no one else did. But that silence, that very absence of acknowledgement, spoke volumes. Her very presence became a symbol of everything the town was refusing to confront. In a place where the enslaved were kept in the margins, her mystery was both a deflection and a mirror to the greater silence that had been imposed on them. The town, steeped in the systems of power that had always ruled, knew that in addressing her, it would have to address everything else, the plantation owners, the system of labor that had fueled their wealth, and the way history had been written to conceal their wrongs. The silence around the girl became a metaphor for the silence that existed around the lives of the enslaved girls who had lived, worked, and died in the shadows, forgotten by all except for the ghosts of the past. Despite the girl's quiet resilience, there was something in the way the town chose to interact with her, or rather, not interact with her, that reflected a deeply rooted unease. The townspeople may have pretended not to notice, but they couldn't escape the fact that her existence challenged their version of reality. She wasn't supposed to be there, not in the way she was, not with her differences and her silence. She was a reminder that, in truth, the town's prosperity had been built on the exploitation of people like her, and in ignoring her, they sought to ignore the past. The town, in its reluctance to confront the complexity of its own history, chose instead to let the silence linger. In many ways, this was a survival mechanism for the town. To confront the truth of their past would be to admit the profound injustices that had shaped their world. It would require them to acknowledge that their wealth, their status, and their very identity had been forged in the crucible of human suffering. But this admission was too painful, too destructive to the sense of self that the town had cultivated over generations. It was easier to pretend that the history they had been taught, the sanitized version, the one that focused on the successes and achievements of the town's founders, was all that mattered. To do otherwise would mean unearthing the uncomfortable truths about the lives of those who had been enslaved and about the ways in which the town had benefited from their labor. The girl, then, became a casualty of this effort to maintain the facade of normalcy. She was both part of and apart from the town's history. On one hand, she was a living reminder of the past of slavery, of stolen labor, of lives reduced to property. On the other hand, her differences, her striking features, made her almost too uncomfortable for the town to truly reckon with. In her silence, she mirrored the larger silence that had been imposed on the enslaved, an erasure that was not just physical but psychological. The people of the town had created a history that excluded them, a history that denied the very real experiences of the enslaved. And the girl, in her quiet existence, was the embodiment of that denial. Over time, the girl's presence grew even more symbolic. She was no longer just an individual who worked in the fields or the house, she had become a living testament to everything the town was trying to ignore. She reminded them of the complexity of their history and the depth of the erasure that had taken place. In the shadows of the town, she was a figure that existed at the edges of their awareness, a figure who, through her very existence, caused the silence to become louder. And yet, no one ever truly confronted the questions she raised. No one ever truly asked where she came from, or why she looked so different, or why her life seemed so strangely out of place in the world that had been constructed around her. In the larger social context of Alabama and the South, this kind of erasure was not unique to this particular town. It was a widespread phenomenon, one that spanned the history of slavery and continued to shape the way the history of the South was written. The stories of the enslaved, especially those of enslaved girls, were routinely left out of the historical narrative. They were not part of the grand story of the nation's founding, nor were they part of the narratives of wealth and prosperity that had been passed down through generations. Their voices were suppressed, their lives ignored, and their identities erased. The girl's story, like the stories of so many others, became a footnote in a history that was written by those who had everything to gain by keeping these voices silent. But her existence, and the silence that surrounded her, suggested something much darker, that the past could never truly be erased. No matter how much the town tried to ignore the truth, the legacy of slavery, and the lives of the enslaved girls who had lived and died in its shadow, would always haunt them. It was a haunting that could never be silenced, no matter how hard they tried. The girl, in her quiet, enigmatic way, had become the embodiment of that haunting. She was a living ghost, a reminder that history, no matter how carefully buried, would always rise again. The silence around her was not an absence, it was a presence in itself. And as long as she remained, the town would never be able to escape the shadows of its past. As time went on, the once subtle undercurrents of unease surrounding the girl began to ripple through the town with increasing intensity. What had started as whispers in dark corners and behind closed doors slowly grew into more open expressions of discomfort. The girl, despite her silence, had become a force, unseen but undeniably present, shaping the lives of those around her in ways they couldn't fully understand or control. She was no longer just an enigma to be dismissed or ignored. Her mere existence had begun to disrupt the delicate balance of the town's social order. And it was this disruption that would eventually push the town to a breaking point, where the carefully constructed narrative of normalcy would shatter and reveal the ugly truths that had been buried for generations. It started with a series of small incidents, moments where the town's usual rhythms were disturbed, if only slightly. At first, the changes were almost imperceptible. A word spoken a little too loudly in the street, a glance held a little too long, an accidental brush of hands that seemed to linger in a way that unsettled. These were the first signs that the tension in the town was growing, that the presence of the girl was starting to chip away at the illusion of order that had held the town together for so long. The girl's physical difference, her inability to blend in with the others, had always made her a subject of fascination and fear, but now it was becoming something more dangerous, an unsettling reminder that things in the town were not as they seemed. The cracks in the town's facade had begun to show, and with each passing day, they seemed to widen. As the girl continued to work among the enslaved people, her differences became even more pronounced. Her physical appearance, the way she looked different from the other girls, had once been something that could be ignored or explained away. But as the tensions in the town mounted, it became impossible for anyone to dismiss her any longer. The girl, with her light skin and strange beauty, had become an anomaly that could not be ignored, no matter how hard the townspeople tried. Her presence reminded them of everything they had tried to bury, the lives of the enslaved people, their exploitation, the horrors that had been masked behind the town's seemingly idyllic exterior. And so, with this growing discomfort came a creeping sense of fear. People began to avoid her, even those who had once worked alongside her, their eyes widening whenever they saw her approaching. The masters and landowners, who had once been able to keep the girl in the background of their minds, now found themselves confronted by her in ways that made them uncomfortable. They began to question her origins more openly, to speculate on whether she was some kind of ghost, a product of the past that had come back to haunt them. This fear only heightened the girl's isolation, as she became more and more distanced from the community around her. But it wasn't just fear that drove the townspeople to edge closer to the breaking point. There was also an underlying sense of guilt. The girl, in her silent way, had begun to expose the lies that the town had built its prosperity upon. She reminded them of their complicity in the system of slavery, of the brutality that had kept the cotton fields productive, of the violence that had been a part of the very foundation of their wealth. It was a guilt that had been buried beneath generations of denial, a guilt that had been masked by the town's prosperity, by the success of the plantations, by the pride they took in their sense of order. But now, as the girl became a more prominent figure in their daily lives, that guilt could no longer be ignored. It was as if she had become a living indictment of the very things the town had long refused to confront. This sense of guilt slowly grew into resentment. The townspeople, desperate to maintain their sense of control, began to place the blame for their discomfort squarely on the girl's shoulders. It was easier to focus on her differences, to see her as the source of their unease, than to confront the deeper, more uncomfortable truths about their own complicity. They began to treat her with increasing hostility, making it clear that her presence was no longer welcome. The casual comments turned into open scorn, the sideways glances into cold stares. The girl, who had once been a quiet presence, now found herself the target of the town's collective frustrations. Her silence, which had once been a form of quiet resistance, now seemed like a challenge to the very fabric of the town's social structure. And yet, despite the hostility, the girl never responded. She continued to carry out her work with a quiet dignity, never raising her voice, never fighting back. It was as if she had accepted her role in the world, as if she had come to understand that the battle for recognition and respect was one she could never win. She was a figure doomed to exist on the margins, never fully part of the world she inhabited, yet never truly free of it either. Her silence, though frustrating to those around her, was also a shield, a way to protect herself from the mounting hostility. It was a defense mechanism, one that allowed her to endure the growing animosity without breaking under its weight. But the tension in the town continued to build, and it eventually reached a boiling point. One afternoon, as the town's residents gathered for a local event, a confrontation occurred, a moment that would forever alter the course of the girl's life. The specifics of the incident are unclear, as the accounts of what happened vary depending on who you ask, but one thing is certain: the girl, who had always kept to herself, was no longer able to remain silent. Whether it was a comment made by one of the town's residents, a physical altercation, or simply the cumulative effect of years of oppression and isolation, something in her snapped. The event quickly escalated. What had started as a simple argument soon turned into a public scene. The girl, who had always been a symbol of quiet resistance, finally spoke out, her voice cutting through the air for the first time in years. Her words, though few, were sharp and full of defiance, a stark contrast to the passive figure she had been up until that moment. The townspeople were stunned. They had never heard her speak, and the power of her words, spoken not with anger, but with an eerie calmness, shook them to their core. The girl's outburst was not just a personal cry for help, but a challenge to the entire structure of the town. Her silence, which had once been a form of survival, was now a weapon, a tool for exposing the hypocrisy that had fueled the town's wealth and success. In that moment, the carefully constructed narrative of the town began to crumble. The facade of order and civility fell away, and what was left was a raw and uncomfortable truth: the town had been built on the backs of the enslaved, and in trying to bury that truth, they had only deepened their own guilt. The event marked the beginning of a larger shift in the town. The girl's words, though brief, would reverberate for years to come. It was as if, in that moment, the silence surrounding the town had been broken, not just by the girl, but by everyone who had ever lived in that silence. The town could no longer ignore the past. The question was no longer whether or not the town would confront its history, but how they would respond to the girl's challenge. The breaking point had come, and with it came a profound shift in the way the town would view itself, its history, and the people who had lived and died in its shadows. For the girl, though, the cost of her defiance was high. The outburst marked a turning point in her life, one that would eventually lead her to a fate that no one could have predicted. But for the town, the consequences were even greater. They could no longer bury their guilt, their shame, or their complicity. The girl had forced them to confront the past, and in doing so, she had irrevocably changed the town's future. After the girl's outburst, the fabric of the town began to slowly unravel. The quiet veneer of normalcy that had held everything in place for generations was now frayed, and the deep, unsettling tension that had been bubbling beneath the surface was finally exposed for all to see. Her words, though simple and few, had pierced through the silence that the town had relied on to shield itself from its past. It was a moment that, though brief, would leave a lasting scar on the town's collective consciousness. The question that had been whispered for so long, the question that no one had dared to ask openly, "Who is she?" had now become something much larger. It was no longer just about her identity, her origins, her differences. It was about everything the town had tried to forget. The unraveling had begun, and with it came the slow but inevitable realization that the town could not escape the consequences of its actions, its past, or its denial. The days following the girl's confrontation were marked by a strange, tense silence. People avoided each other in the streets, their eyes averted, their conversations hushed. The town that had once prided itself on its tight-knit community now seemed fractured, as if something had shifted irrevocably. Those who had once looked the other way, who had once been content to pretend that the past was something that could be safely ignored, now found themselves faced with the undeniable reality that the past was always present. The girl had made sure of that. In a world built on the silence of the oppressed, her voice had become the spark that set everything alight. At first, many tried to pretend that nothing had changed. The landowners and the wealthy families, who had grown accustomed to having their histories go unchallenged, initially reacted with disbelief. They tried to ignore the growing sense of unease, convincing themselves that the townspeople would soon return to their normal lives. But deep down, they knew something had shifted. The walls that had long separated the town's elites from the reality of their position, standing on the backs of the enslaved, had started to crumble. And for some, the fear of what might come next was palpable. The girl's words had done more than just stir up old questions about her. They had brought to light the larger, darker truths that had always been there, hidden in plain sight. The girl, with her quiet defiance, had become a symbol of resistance, a living, breathing testament to the suffering that had fueled the town's prosperity. And for those who had worked so hard to maintain their comfortable lives, this revelation was a challenge they could not easily dismiss. The truth was no longer something that could be avoided, it had become a presence that demanded to be reckoned with. The enslaved workers who had once lived in the shadows, whose lives had been shaped by fear and suffering, began to take note of the growing unrest. They, too, felt the shift, the way the town seemed to grow more tense, more watchful. For the first time in a long while, there was a sense of possibility in the air. The girl had done what no one else had dared to do. She had spoken out. Her words, though simple, had given voice to something that had been silent for far too long. And though she did not know it, her defiance had opened a door that could not easily be closed again. In the days following her outburst, there were more murmurs among the enslaved. Some spoke of what the girl had said, others of what might come next. The fear that had once paralyzed them, fear of punishment, of reprisal, of an existence lived in constant submission, began to crack. The girl, with her courage, had given them something they had not dared to hope for, a reminder that their voices could still matter, that their lives could be something more than mere instruments of labor. For the first time, there was a collective awareness that something could change, that their suffering was not the only story, that there was power in their shared histories and in their silence turned into action. The unraveling had begun, and they were not entirely powerless to shape it. As the days turned into weeks, the tension continued to mount. The girl's presence, once a source of quiet discomfort, was now a living, breathing force that seemed to weigh heavily on everyone around her. The townspeople could no longer look at her without being reminded of the dark truths they had spent so long ignoring. Her identity was no longer just a matter of speculation, she had become a mirror, reflecting everything the town had refused to see. And as the townspeople faced the discomfort of their own complicity, they began to turn on each other. Friends became strangers, neighbors became enemies. The girl's challenge had fractured the very unity the town had once prided itself on. Among the enslaved, too, there was a shift. The sense of solidarity that had been quietly growing in the wake of the girl's defiance began to crystallize into something more tangible. Conversations once held in hushed tones became more open. There was a sense that, together, they might be able to effect some kind of change. The girl had given them a voice that, for so long, had been suppressed by fear and violence. But with that voice came the burden of what it might mean to speak, to act, to resist. The risk was immense. The repercussions could be deadly. And yet, there was also the sense that the time for silence was over. The girl, in many ways, had set something in motion that could no longer be undone. Whether she realized it or not, her words had ignited a fire that had been smoldering for years, decades, even, within the town. The girl had become more than just an individual, she had become a catalyst for change. And as the town began to unravel, the first signs of what would follow became clear. There would be no returning to the way things were. The past was no longer something that could be buried. It was something that had to be confronted, no matter how uncomfortable, no matter how dangerous. As the town's social structure began to deteriorate, rumors began to spread. Whispers about the girl's future, about the consequences of her defiance, grew louder. The town's leaders, desperate to restore order, began to take action. They tried to stifle the growing unrest, to contain the fear and uncertainty that was spreading like wildfire. But the more they tried to control the situation, the more they found that their power had diminished. The people, once passive and submissive, were beginning to find their voices. And in doing so, they were shifting the very balance of power. The unraveling had begun in earnest, and there was no telling where it would end. The town, once so sure of its place in the world, was now teetering on the edge of something unknown. The girl, who had once been an isolated, silent figure, was now at the center of a larger story, a story that was unfolding in real time, a story that could not be rewritten, no matter how hard the town tried. The past, in all its complexity, was coming back to haunt them. And in that haunting, they were being forced to reckon with everything they had tried to forget. The girl, for all her silence and defiance, had become a symbol of something much larger, the inescapable truth of the past, and the unrelenting consequences of trying to erase it. She had ignited a fire, and now the town had to decide whether to face the flames or burn. As the pressure in the town continued to mount, the fragile structure that had once held everything together began to crumble. The unraveling, which had begun with a single outburst, now escalated into something far more dangerous and far more visible. The townspeople, no longer able to ignore the discomfort that had been sparked by the girl's defiance, began to react in increasingly desperate ways. Denial, which had long been their shield, could no longer protect them from the truth. The past, once comfortably buried under layers of revisionist history, was coming to light, and the townspeople found themselves unprepared to face it. At first, the reactions were subtle. Landowners, who had grown accustomed to their dominance and the unquestioned stability of their positions, began to retreat into their homes, away from the growing unrest. They started to avoid public spaces, holding meetings behind closed doors, conspiring in the shadows to find a solution to the growing problem. It was not that they feared the girl herself, but rather the power her silence had unearthed. Her presence had turned the spotlight on the very system they had built their lives upon, a system that had allowed them to prosper at the expense of the enslaved. And for the first time, that system was being questioned, openly, and with growing support from those who had once been invisible. The tension in the town grew unbearable. Public gatherings became strained affairs. What had once been simple conversations in the streets were now tinged with suspicion, with the unspoken realization that something had changed. The atmosphere was thick with unease. People who had once greeted each other with familiarity now avoided eye contact, unsure of how to navigate the new reality that had been thrust upon them. The quiet comfort of the town, which had been built on the idea of a predictable and controlled world, was slipping away. In its place was a simmering chaos, a sense that the delicate balance that had kept everything in place for so long was no longer stable. But it was not just the elite landowners who felt the pressure. The enslaved people, who had long been forced to live in the margins of society, began to recognize that their silence and submission could no longer sustain the system. For generations, they had lived under the weight of subjugation, never daring to speak out, never daring to hope for anything beyond the life they had been assigned. But the girl's defiance had given them something they had never known before, the belief that they could change their fate, that they could demand more. Her silence had been their silence, her resistance had been their resistance, and now, as the walls of denial began to collapse, they too found themselves standing on the precipice of a new reality. The girl, for all her quiet strength, was no longer merely a symbol of resistance. She had become a rallying point, a focal point around which the enslaved people began to unite. They no longer saw her as an anomaly, an outlier, someone who did not quite belong. Instead, they saw her as one of their own, a representative of their collective struggle, their collective desire for freedom and recognition. They began to speak of her in reverential terms, seeing in her the courage to confront what they had longed to confront but had never dared to express. It was in her silence that they found their own voices, and as the town's facade continued to crack, they began to speak openly of their own desires for freedom, for acknowledgement, for justice. The landowners, however, were not as easily swayed. For them, the girl's challenge was not just a personal affront, but a direct threat to the very system that had allowed them to maintain power. The more the enslaved people began to speak out, the more the landowners realized that the town was on the verge of something they could not control. Their fear grew, and with it came a brutal desire to reassert their dominance, to re-establish the hierarchy that had been so carefully constructed over the years. They tried to rally the townspeople, appealing to their sense of loyalty, their sense of tradition, but their words fell on deaf ears. The town was no longer the place it had been. The veil of ignorance and complacency that had shielded them from the truth was lifting, and with it, the harsh reality of their past was coming into full view. In the midst of this growing storm, the girl became a beacon of hope for those who had long suffered in silence. Her earlier defiance had cracked open a door, and now the enslaved people were ready to push through it. They began to take small actions, quiet acts of rebellion that slowly grew in intensity. What had started as whispered conversations in the dark corners of the town became more organized efforts. They began to defy the rules that had long confined them. They spoke openly about their pain, their suffering, and their desires for a different life. They demanded their voices be heard. And though their actions were still small and seemingly insignificant in the face of the power that the landowners wielded, they were a sign of a much larger shift, a shift that could no longer be undone. The landowners, desperate to maintain control, responded with force. They tightened their grip, imposing stricter rules, increasing surveillance, and making examples of those who dared to step out of line. But their efforts only fueled the fire of resistance. The more they pushed back, the more determined the enslaved became. The town, once so sure of its place in the world, was now on the brink of collapse. The systems that had been in place for so long were no longer sufficient to contain the rising tide of discontent. What had once been a carefully structured society was beginning to show signs of profound instability. As the tension reached its breaking point, the girl, who had once been a figure of quiet mystery, became an active participant in the unraveling. Her words, once few and far between, now carried weight. She spoke to the other enslaved people, urging them to continue their fight, to demand their freedom, to refuse to be silenced any longer. The girl's silence, which had once been a form of resistance in itself, was now replaced by a determined, articulate voice that called for action. She had become the symbol of a movement, one that transcended her individual story and became a collective fight for justice and recognition. The collapse of denial had begun in earnest. The town, its people, and its systems could no longer ignore the truth. What had once been hidden in plain sight, the exploitation, the suffering, the stolen labor, was now at the forefront of everyone's mind. The girl had sparked a reckoning, and there was no going back. The landowners could no longer pretend that their wealth was anything other than blood-stained. The enslaved people could no longer pretend that their silence would protect them. The town was at a crossroads, and it was no longer clear which path it would take. The collapse of denial had set in motion a chain of events that would forever alter the town. What had once been a well-ordered, seemingly peaceful community was now a battleground, a place where the past and the present collided with brutal force. The landowners, desperate to maintain control, would not let go easily. But the enslaved people, fueled by their newfound voice and solidarity, were not willing to back down. The girl, who had once been a figure of quiet resistance, had become the catalyst for a movement that would challenge everything the town had built its identity upon. The collapse of denial had begun, and there was no telling how it would end. As the tensions in the town reached their peak, something was inevitable. There would be a great confrontation, a moment where all the hidden fears, all the unresolved questions, would spill into the open. The escalating unrest, which had started with hushed whispers and small, quiet acts of rebellion, had now snowballed into a force too powerful to contain. The girl, once a mere figure on the fringes, was now a symbol of the unspoken truth, the very truth the town had spent generations trying to suppress. Her quiet defiance had ignited a fire, and the flames were spreading faster than anyone could control. It was no longer just about her. It was about everything, the town's history, its wealth, its very foundation. And in this moment, there was no turning back. The town was about to face its reckoning. The confrontation began to take shape as the enslaved people, emboldened by the girl's courage, took bolder steps. They stopped silently accepting their lot, they stopped merely enduring. The girl's defiance had shown them that resistance, even in the face of overwhelming power, was possible. Their voices, once stifled, became louder. And as their voices grew, so did the fear among the landowners and those who had benefited from the system of slavery. The economic power that had been so carefully cultivated for generations now seemed at risk of slipping from their grasp. The landowners, who had never truly considered the possibility of losing their dominion, now found themselves backed into a corner. The delicate balance of control that they had established over the enslaved population was beginning to falter. It was in this charged atmosphere that the great confrontation began to form. The girl, who had long been a figure of silence and mystery, became the focal point of a standoff between two opposing forces. On one side were the landowners, determined to hold on to their power, to keep the status quo intact at any cost. On the other side were the enslaved, emboldened by their newfound solidarity and their belief that their suffering could no longer go unchallenged. And at the center of it all stood the girl, the catalyst of this rising rebellion, the spark that had lit the fire of resistance. In the days leading up to the confrontation, rumors swirled through the town. The landowners, desperate to maintain their control, began to make threats. The enslaved, their patience stretched to its breaking point, began to prepare. What had once been a whispered rebellion was now becoming an open call for action. There was talk of escape, of reclaiming what was theirs, of standing up against the very systems that had kept them bound for so long. The question was no longer whether they would confront the landowners, but when. The time for quiet submission had passed. Now, it was time for action. The girl, for her part, did not retreat into the shadows. She stood firm, her presence a constant reminder of the power that had been unleashed. Her defiance had given strength to those who had once been afraid to speak out, and now her resolve became the touchstone for the growing movement. She did not lead with words but with actions. Her calm, unyielding presence was the proof that resistance was possible, that even in the most oppressive circumstances, change could come. The landowners, though they tried to silence her, could not undo the effect she had had. Her influence had spread far beyond the confines of her own life. The first signs of the great confrontation came when a small group of enslaved people, emboldened by the girl's defiance, openly challenged the authority of the landowners. It started as a simple act, refusing to follow orders, questioning the restrictions placed on them, but it quickly escalated. The landowners, already on edge, responded with violence. They attempted to force the enslaved back into submission, using the power of their position to try to crush the small sparks of rebellion. But the more they pushed, the stronger the resistance became. It was as if the girls' defiance had unlocked something in them, something that could no longer be repressed. In the midst of this chaos, the girl stood at the forefront, her quiet resistance transforming into something far more active. She had become the symbol of this uprising. The landowners had underestimated her influence, assuming that she was just another insignificant piece of the machinery of subjugation. But she was not. She had become the fulcrum on which the balance of power was shifting. The enslaved people, once broken and divided, now saw her as a leader. It was not because of any formal command she gave, but because of the way she had refused to bend. She had shown them that even the smallest act of defiance could have rippling consequences. The confrontation reached its peak when the enslaved, led by the girl's example, took their stand. Armed with little more than their resolve, they confronted the landowners directly. The moment was charged with tension, every step a move toward inevitable conflict. The air was thick with fear, anger, and anticipation. The landowners, once so confident in their power, were now forced to face the truth of their situation. They could no longer maintain the illusion of control. The rebellion, which had started as a quiet murmur, was now an open, undeniable force. The confrontation itself was violent, though not in the traditional sense. There were no grand battles or bloody clashes. Instead, it was a struggle of wills, a contest of endurance. The landowners attempted to force the enslaved back into their place through intimidation, threats, and brute force. But the enslaved, galvanized by the girl's leadership and the swelling tide of rebellion, stood their ground. They refused to back down. They refused to return to the submission that had defined their lives for so long. It was not a victory achieved through violence, but through the power of their collective refusal to continue living in chains, both literal and metaphorical. In the end, the confrontation did not result in a clear, immediate resolution. The landowners were not defeated outright, nor did the enslaved achieve full freedom in that moment. But something much more profound had occurred. The town, which had once operated under a carefully crafted illusion of control and stability, was forever altered. The systems that had once held the town in place were now exposed as fragile, built on foundations of fear and denial. And in that exposure, the enslaved had found their voice. The confrontation had not been about defeating the landowners, it had been about showing them, and the town as a whole, that their power was not invincible, that they too were vulnerable. What followed in the aftermath of the confrontation was a period of profound uncertainty. The landowners, now fully aware of how close they had come to losing everything, scrambled to reassert control. But the damage had already been done. The walls of oppression had been cracked, and they could not be repaired. The enslaved people, though not yet free, had tasted the power of resistance. They had shown the landowners, and themselves, that they were not powerless. The girl, once a solitary figure on the margins, had become the spark that ignited a fire that could not be extinguished. The great confrontation marked a turning point in the town's history. It was not the end of the struggle, but the beginning of something much larger, an unraveling that could not be ignored. The town, once so sure of its place in the world, was now forced to reckon with its past and its present. And the girl, in her quiet, powerful defiance, had shown them that the truth could not be silenced. The great confrontation had begun, and its echoes would reverberate for generations to come. The great confrontation, though it had not yielded a clear resolution, marked the beginning of an irreversible shift in the town. The dust had not yet settled when the consequences of that moment began to unfold in ways no one could have anticipated. The immediate aftermath was one of confusion, fear, and a profound sense of loss. The landowners, once so confident in their authority, now found themselves uncertain of their place in a world that seemed to be rapidly changing around them. The enslaved, who had for so long lived under the weight of silence and subjugation, were now faced with a new reality, one in which their voices, though still muted, could no longer be fully ignored. The town, caught between these two forces, was teetering on the edge of something unknown. In the weeks following the confrontation, the landowners attempted to regain control, to reassert their dominance over the enslaved. They tightened their grip, using fear and intimidation in a desperate attempt to suppress the growing unrest. But they found themselves struggling against an invisible tide. The enslaved, though not yet free, had tasted the power of resistance. They had seen the cracks in the system, the vulnerabilities in the structure that had long held them in place. And now, they were not so easily cowed. The idea that they could, at the very least, challenge the system, that they could resist, had taken root. Even in the face of the landowners' renewed efforts to control them, the enslaved found a kind of quiet strength in their unity. The girl, for her part, became an even more significant figure in the aftermath of the confrontation. Though she had not led the rebellion in a traditional sense, she had become a symbol of the resistance. Her quiet defiance had sparked a movement, and though the town's power structures had tried to crush it, they could not extinguish the idea that the enslaved had power, power in their unity, power in their voices, and power in their refusal to accept the status quo. In many ways, the girl had become the face of this quiet revolution. She was not a leader in the typical sense, but rather a mirror reflecting the deeper truths that the town had been reluctant to face. The landowners' attempts to reassert control only served to deepen the divide. Their fear and desperation became evident in every public action they took. They issued threats, enacted stricter laws, and cracked down harder on any signs of disobedience. But each time they did, the lines between the enslaved and the rest of the town grew more defined. There were fewer illusions now. The enslaved people were no longer the invisible, mute laborers they had once been. Their voices were no longer silent. The girl had shown them that. And now, despite the landowners' efforts to silence them, the enslaved were finding ways to speak, to organize, and to demand something more from a world that had long denied them basic humanity. However, the town's response to the aftermath was not just limited to fear and resistance. There was also a profound sense of guilt that hung over the landowners and many of the townspeople. This was not a guilt that could be easily dismissed. For the first time, the people of the town were forced to confront the brutality of their history, the violence, the exploitation, and the systemic oppression that had fueled their prosperity. The landowners, in particular, were now left with the unsettling realization that their wealth had been built on the backs of the enslaved. The very system that had allowed them to live in comfort and security had been built on a foundation of cruelty. And as the enslaved began to speak, began to rise, that foundation began to crack. But this guilt, though undeniable, did not lead to action. In many ways, it led to further denial. The landowners, unable or unwilling to fully confront the consequences of their actions, continued to focus on maintaining their grip on power. They offered platitudes, empty promises, and continued to rely on their status to shield them from the demands for change. Some even tried to use the girl's example as a cautionary tale.